Chapter 2. Who was the first person? Most chapters in this book are headed by a question. My purpose is to answer the question, or at least give the best possible answer, which is the answer of science. But I shall usually begin with some mythical answers because they are colorful and interesting, and real people have believed them. Some people still do. All peoples around the world have origin myths to account for where they came from. Many tribal origin myths talk only about that one particular tribe, as though other tribes don't count. In the same way, many tribes have a rule that they mustn't kill people, but people turns out to mean only others of your own tribe. Killing members of other tribes is just fine. Here's a typical origin myth from a group of Tasmanian Aborigines. A god called Moani was defeated by a rival god called Dromardiner in a terrible battle up in the stars. Moani fell out of the stars down to Tasmania to die. Before he died, he wanted to give a last blessing to his final resting place, so he decided to create humans. But he was in such a hurry, knowing he was dying, that he forgot to give them knees, and, no doubt distracted by his plight, he absent-mindedly gave them big tails like kangaroos, which meant they couldn't sit down. Then he died. The people hated having kangaroo tails and no knees, and they cried out to the heavens for help. The mighty Dromardiner, who was still roaring around the sky on his victory parade, heard their cry and came down to Tasmania to see what the matter was. He took pity on the people, gave them bendable knees, and cut off their inconvenient kangaroo tails so they could all sit down at last, and they lived happily ever after. Quite often, we meet different versions of the same myth. That's not surprising, because people often change details while telling tales around the campfire, so local versions of the stories drift apart. In a different telling of this Tasmanian myth, Moani created the first man, called Parlavar, up in the sky. Parlavar couldn't sit down because he had a tail like a kangaroo and unbendable knees. As before, the rival star god Dromardiner came to the rescue. He gave Parlavar proper knees and cut off his tail, healing the wound with grease. Parlavar then came down to Tasmania, walking along the sky road, the Milky Way. The Hebrew tribes of the Middle East had only a single god, whom they regarded as superior to the gods of rival tribes. He had various names, none of which they were allowed to say. He made the first man out of dust and called him Adam, which just means man. He deliberately made Adam like himself. Indeed, most of the gods of history were portrayed as men, or sometimes women, often of giant size and always with supernatural powers. The god placed Adam in a beautiful garden called Eden, filled with trees whose fruit Adam was encouraged to eat, with one exception. This forbidden tree was the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and the god left Adam in no doubt that he must never eat its fruit. The god then realized that Adam might be lonely all by himself and wanted to do something about it. At this point, as with the story of Dromardiner and Moani, there are two versions of the myth, both found in the biblical book of Genesis. In the more colorful version, the god made all the animals as Adam's helpers, then decided that there was still something missing, a woman. So he gave Adam a general anesthetic, cut him open, removed one rib, and stitched him up again. Then he grew a woman from the rib, rather as you grow a flower from a cutting. He named her Eve and presented her to Adam as his wife. Unfortunately, there was a wicked snake in the garden who approached Eve and persuaded her to give Adam the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Adam and Eve ate the fruit and promptly acquired the knowledge that they were naked. This embarrassed them, and they made themselves aprons out of fig leaves. When the god noticed this, he was furious with them for eating the fruit and acquiring knowledge, losing their innocence, I suppose. He threw them out of the garden and condemned them and all their descendants to a life of hardship and pain. To this day, the story of Adam's and Eve's terrible disobedience is still taken seriously by many people under the name of original sin. Some people even believe we have all inherited this original sin from Adam, although many of them admit that Adam never actually existed and share in his guilt. The Norse peoples of Scandinavia, famous as Viking seafarers, had lots of gods, as the Greeks and Romans did. The name of their chief god was Odin, sometimes called Wotan or Woden, from which we get our Wednesday. Thursday comes from another Norse god, Thor, the god of thunder, which he made with his mighty hammer. One day Odin was walking along the seashore with his brothers, who were also gods, and they came upon 2 tree trunks. One of these tree trunks they turned into the first man, whom they called Ask, and the other they turned into the first woman, naming her Embla. Having created the bodies of the first man and first woman, the brother gods then gave them the breath of life, followed by consciousness, faces, and the gift of speech. Why tree trunks, I wonder? Why not icicles or sand dunes? Isn't it fascinating to wonder who made such stories up and why? Presumably, the original inventors of all these myths knew they were fiction at the moment when they made them up. Or do you think many different people came up with different parts of the stories at different times and in different places, and other people later put them together, perhaps changing some of them without realizing that the various bits were originally just made up? Stories are fun, and we all love repeating them. But when we hear a colorful story, whether it is an ancient myth or a modern urban legend whizzing around the internet, it is also worth stopping to ask whether it, or any part of it, is true. So let's ask ourselves that question. Who was the first person? And take a look at the true scientific answer.